Hello and happy Friday. As usual, we've just started the stream, so we'll give it a few moments and let more people join. So while I'm waiting, I will just make sure I've got everything closed and nothing's going to pop up. Can't see anyone watching quite yet, so we'll give it. Yep, we've got our first viewer. Welcome, welcome. Up to 4, right? I'll give it another 10 seconds and then we will get going. How is everybody? Hope you're well. It's a pretty miserable day from where I'm sitting. Perfect weekend to do some family history. Hi Ellie, thanks very much for joining. Great. I'll give it. Yeah, right, let's start. We're a minute in. Brilliant. Well, happy Friday. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you're all well. I hope you're not finding the lockdown too taxing. Hello, Kevin. I hope you're well. Obviously, we've just found out that we're gonna be enjoying this for another 3 weeks, I think. So 3 more weeks to keep ourselves busy, 3 more weeks to stay indoors, 3 more weeks to do more research, I guess. Um, oh, hi, William. I hope your other video chat goes well. Hello, Linda. So yeah, what are we talking about today? Well, quite a lot actually. As usual, I've given myself loads to talk about, probably more than I can actually work my way through. But yeah, there were some really fascinating anniversaries this week. Obviously, the big one is the sinking of the RMS Titanic, which was on April 12th. Yes, I did get that right. And of course, it's I can't remember exactly what anniversary it is now. But yeah, no, not 1912, not April 12th, April the 15th, 1912. That's it. The sinking of the RMS Titanic. So 2 days ago. And with that in mind, I thought we would have a look in some of because we've actually got loads of records on Findmypast that relate directly to the Titanic disaster. I didn't realise this. We've got loads of different resources, and when you combine them all together, you can find loads of information. And obviously, every passenger on that ship had a story. And I've had great fun delving into those a little bit deeper and learning more about who was on board, what the conditions were like on board. So yeah, I wanted to share some of that with you. Also, tomorrow marks a very, very interesting anniversary as well. Well, interesting or uninteresting, it depends on how you look at it. Basically, 70, no, 100, 70 years, 80 years ago tomorrow, um, the BBC Radio News announced that there was no news that day, and they just played some piano music. I thought that's quite a charming little anecdote from the past, and it really shows how much times have changed, how media and broadcasting's changed, how the nature of news and what we deem newsworthy has changed. And yeah, it's just a kind of charming little reminder of how different things were in some ways. So yeah, I wanted to take a little bit of a closer look at that and see, is it true? Was there genuinely no news on April the 30th, on April the 18th, 1930? Um, and if there was, why wasn't it reported? And that's turned up quite a lot of interesting things about the history of the British Broadcasting Corporation, the nature of news and how it was shared. So yeah, we'll have a look at that, of course. But obviously it's Friday, so we've got brand new records. We've got a load of new records this week, so we'll have a quick look at those as well. And also, I thought, depending on how we get on for time, thought we could have a little look at some life lessons from life on the home front during World War II. We're living through, I think it's fair to say we're living through completely unprecedented times at the moment. And I think if we could compare today to anything from our history, really, it would probably be the restrictions that were put on people's daily lives during the Second World War. And of course, the whole Blitz spirit and that keep calm attitude is still celebrated today. But yeah, what kind of practices and ways of living could we look back on and maybe use ourselves? So yeah, we'll have a look at all that. But lovely to see everybody tuning in. Thank you to everyone who tuned in last week as well. And thank you so much to Ellie as well for doing her first ever live Friday broadcast. It was brilliant. I'm glad you're loving the vid, Jackie. My wife really isn't. I do urgently need to get some newspaper razor blades. Um, Haircut and a shave, I definitely think is in order. It's part of the reason why I wore a shirt, so I didn't look too scruffy. Hello, Karen. Hello, Sylvia. Hello, Diane. Hello, Anya. Hello, Jackie. Hello, Margaret. Hello, Tess. Hello, Brenda. Hello, Paul. Love to see you, Paul. Hello, Amanda. Hello, William. Hello, Sheila. Hello, Julie. Hello, Claire. Wow, so many people. Hello, Ruth. Asking about 1921 records. No, I'm afraid not. Digitization is still very much underway. And also the Census Act means that we are unable to publish until 2022. Sadly, our hands are tied. Oh yes, Nicole, thank you for answering question of the week. You just reminded me question of the week. So if you're tuning in to this for the first time, I hope some of you are. We do these every single Friday. It's a way for us to keep in touch with all of you lot. Talk to each other, share some behind the scenes news from Findmypast, tell some stories, all that kind of stuff. But the main purpose really is for us, especially during these times where we all are all stuck at home isolated, is to stay in touch and talk to each other. And to get the ball rolling, we ask a question of the week every single week. And as this week marked the anniversary of the Titanic sinking, I thought we should. I thought it would be quite interesting to hear stories about each other's seafaring ancestors. Of course, travel by sea was was the only way of leaving the country until the dawn of air travel. And of course, it came with many, many risks. As time went on, those risks were diminished, but they were still there. I mean, I think I remember going to church with my mum and my grandfather, and that prayer they always used to read out, those who go down to the sea in ships and do business in great waters. That always used to strike a bit of a chord with me. And I think it was because deep down I knew that, so many people throughout the course of history have literally gone down into the sea. I mean, have drowned, have lost their lives sailing the oceans, whether it's to go somewhere new, to emigrate or start a new life or conduct business, or whether it's in the merchant navy, transporting goods and food and supplies to keep nations fed, all that kind of stuff. And being that those of us watching the UK are from such a seafaring nation, seafaring and all things maritime is such a huge part of our history. I think most of us have at least one or two ancestors who did go to the sea in ships. Whether that be in passenger lists, migration records, crew lists, naval records, merchant navy seaman records. What have you discovered? So Nicole Hassel said, I have a three times great grandfather who was supposed to be a mariner when he married my three times great grandmother. And Sylvia said, hubby had a seafarer in Dorset. Family story was that he drowned in Poole Harbour after a night on the tiles. Sadly, it was not the case. It was syphilis. Isn't family history amazing, Sylvia? And I mean, I think just to prove how many of us did have seafaring ancestors, quite a few people have already sent in answers for this. So Christopher Jones said, my great grandfather Joseph Pfaff emigrated from Germany to Australia in pursuit of gold. One of the many who flocked over there during the gold rushes. To get there, he first had to survive the sinking of the RMS Taylor, the first Titanic in 1854, sailing from Liverpool. She ran aground off the coast of Dublin. Of more than 650 aboard, only 280 survived. Again, prime example of how you really were taking your life in your hands when you left the coasts of Britain or anywhere for that matter to take the seas. A few weeks later, he resumed his journey to Victoria on the Golden Era. I think it'd take great courage and determination to get back on board a ship, having only recently survived such a horrific ordeal where so many drowned. I admire him so much. Yeah, I think it certainly did, and that's definitely worthy of admiration. But again, prime example of how dangerous travel at sea could be. Kimberly Thompson said, two of my grandmother's brothers were at the Battle of Jutland on different boats, one on the Monarch and one on the other on the Tiger, both very famous ships. Oh wow, both didn't know if the other had survived until afterwards. I found their service record, which notes their physical appearance, the boats they were on while serving, and their conduct. One brother had followed the other to sea but forgot his father's signature. 3 months at sea before he could be sent home. Wow, that's great story. And again, a reminder of how fantastic seafaring records can be. I mean, from my family, I guess I've my father's naval records. He served in the Channel, North Atlantic, and in the Pacific during the Second World War. Also, quite similar to Kim's story, my wife's great grandfather I can't remember his rank, but he was very senior in the Royal Navy, and he was at the Battle of Jutland. We have his World War One naval service records, but I can't remember which ship he was on for the life of me. It's great. I can see. Oh, great! Hi, Seamus. Irish Family Search. Thank you very much for tuning in. Just having a look at the comments. Yeah, talking about 1939 registries. Well, great. Anyway, I think I'll crack on anyway because I'm already 10 minutes in. So I'll get the what I no, I'll get the records out the way first. So what have we added this week? We have new records every single week. Today is no different. We've got over 2.8 million records, and there's definitely a bit of a theme here. I'd say it's heavily on the burial side of things. If you want to keep up to date with all the records we have each week, all you have to do is go to the What's New section of our blog, where we post our updates each and every week. And as I know Ellie is watching and in the comments, hopefully Ellie can pop a comment, pop a link to that post in the comments so you can see what we've added this week. But basically, in a nutshell, big old update to the Greater London Burial Index. About 31,000 new records covering 10 parishes across the Greater London area, which is pretty big. So just a few, just to summarise: Edmonton, Enfield, Southwark, St Andrew, St Anne and St Agnes, St Bennet, Paul's Wharf, St Dunstan in the west, St Mary Magdalene, lots. And the lovely thing about the Greater London Burial Index records is they are actually quite detailed. So as well as finding out where and when your ancestor was buried, you will also get their age at death, their occupation, and their religious dominant denomination. So that's a hard one to say at 4 o'clock on a Friday. So as well as the Greater London burials, we've added a load more Surrey records as well, over 450,000 Surrey burials. If you want to know exactly which parishes they cover, check out the parish list, which is in the useful links and resources section, which you'll find on every single search page. And the other updates we've made are to the United States Billion Graves and the Canada Billion Graves indexes. And we actually have Billion Graves indexes for England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. I think that's all of them. But they're brilliant collections. These ones that we put up in partnership with Billion Graves, which is the largest online archive of GPS tagged headstone and burial records in the world. So the great things about these records are that in many instances, as well as a GPS tag for the exact location of that grave, you will often get a photo of the memorial itself. So for example, if you pop in Ernest Hemingway's grave, you will see a lovely photo, which I'm just looking at now, of Ernest Hemingway's grave, which people have left a bottle of red wine and a can of Guinness on, because the guy did like a drink, and loads of coins in respect as well. But yeah, they're just a fantastic resource. So if if you're ever planning on paying your respects and visiting an ancestor's grave in person, it can be pretty tricky. Now if you don't have a cemetery plan or a plot number, it can be quite hard to find. And in some cases, headstones are so damaged that they're barely legible. Well, Billion Graves gives you the exact GPS coordinates, so you can go find them. If you're ever thinking of doing a heritage tour to somewhere like Ireland to visit the hometowns of your Irish ancestors, Irish Billion Graves Index is a great way of finding out exactly where their graves were. Anyway, so we've added over 97,000 to the Canada Index and over 2.1 million to the United States Index. So yeah, pretty beefy updates there. And as well as all these burial records, we've added new newspapers. We've added the West Bridgford Advertiser, the Beds and Herts Pictorial, nice illustrated publication there, Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire, covering the 20s and early 30s. And we've also done a load of updates to existing newspapers like the Manchester Evening News, which I think is one of the most interesting newspapers in British history, probably. That and the Manchester Guardian. Something about Manchester, they produced fantastic newspapers. Don't know why. But yeah, that is this week's records. So before I start sharing the fascinating stories I pulled from the Titanic records, let's have a look. Rosie Morrill said, question of the week, good info on the newspapers on sloops built for my great uncle in Grimsby. Well worth a look for departures and arrivals. Thank you, Ali. Just see you popping the link in the comments. Tess, I would love to find more records about specific ships and who worked on them. I've found a few notices in newspapers, but everyone has the same name and no other info is provided. Well, Tess, passenger lists often do split out crew from passengers. You will often find crew in the crew list sections. Merchant Navy records are often a very good way of looking as well, if they were in the Merchant Navy. But on the subject of the Titanic, so as I said earlier, the 15th of April, so 2 days ago, marked the anniversary of the sinking of the ship, very famously. I think I don't need to recap the story for you because you probably all know very well. Struck an iceberg, not enough lifeboats, terrible loss of life. I think it's still one of the worst um, peacetime marine disasters in history. Actually, I think over 1,500 people tragically lost their lives, which is in one single sinking, is extraordinary. Sorry, I just saw a message from a colleague distracting me. But yeah, I think one of the things that made the disaster so terrible was the rate at which the ship sunk. Obviously, it was unthinkable. Um, Sorry, I'm just going to close my messenger app. But yeah, anyway, terrible loss of life. But as I said before, when you've got resources, obviously newspapers, there is so much in our collection of newspapers about the sinking. Eyewitness testimonies, interviews with survivors, hundreds, maybe thousands of interviews with survivors. Um, Incredible stories of bravery, self-sacrifice, also stories on the other end of the spectrum highlighting some of the less gallant conduct that was witnessed. But yeah, when you combine these with the passenger lists and other resources like our collection of White Star Line officers' books, you can find out a lot about the people who are on board. So in terms of the White Star Line officers' books, so this is a collection we have. I think I'm not. I don't know if it came from the National Archives, but anyway, it's got about over 1,000 commanders and officers who served as navigators or other officers on ships of the White Star Line, and obviously the most famous vessel of the line was the ill-fated Titanic. So therefore, you will find a lot of the officers from the Titanic in these books. They will provide you with loads of career details about them, the different vessels they served on, their specialties, ages, training information, all that kind of stuff. Really detailed records. But really, it's the passenger lists. So the passenger lists were a huge project. We digitized those with the National Archives, I believe, back in around 2012. So prior to my time at Findmypast. But it was a huge project. They were huge. And one of the slightly annoying things about passenger lists, though, is that different ships with the same name are not that easy to distinguish in ship search. But the Titanic is an exception, because the Titanic wasn't the only Titanic. There was an 1894 to 1900 ship that had the same name, but because the RMS Titanic is of such historical significance, these were listed completely separately. So you can view the full passenger lists for RMS Titanic well, almost in their entirety. Um, Pretty big lists. Before they were digitized, I think they were kept in something like 34 separate boxes at the National Archives in Kew. And they're lovely and detailed. So what you're going to see individuals, what class they were travelling in, where they were planning to land, their country of intended future permanent residence, loads more stuff like that. And as well as the passenger lists, obviously you've got Merchant Navy crew lists. So quite a lot of the staff on board the Titanic, particularly people who worked in engine rooms, engineers, firemen, things like that, had previously served in the Merchant Navy. And Merchant Navy crew lists are very detailed. They'll often give physical descriptions. So yeah, as I was saying, you combine all these together and you can uncover quite a lot. And I thought it's such a huge story with so many different. Well, there are so many stories. Where to start? So I thought maybe an interesting way of doing it would be, um, obviously sailors are notoriously superstitious. There are many maritime superstitions, things you are meant to do to ensure your safety at sea. That again, that's probably a side effect of it being so dangerous. There's these little psychological tricks sailors could help themselves with to kind of waylay fears of danger and death at sea. But anyway, yeah. there were loads of superstitions, and I thought, which ones did the Titanic ignore? And there was quite a few. So I've kind of pulled together a list of seven. Is it seven? Yes, it is six or seven superstitions that the Titanic ignored, and the evidence for how they ignored those superstitions is in the records. So anyway, um, obviously nowadays it's pretty easy to dismiss these beliefs as nonsense, but for a pretty massive part of history, these would have been very important to our seafaring ancestors. So what was the first one? Well, sailor superstition number one was that women on board a ship can make the sea angry. Yeah, this was something that was believed by many sailors for a very long time. And all you need to do is have a look at the header pages from the ship's passenger list for the Titanic. And straight away, it says 353 female passengers were travelling on board. Of course, these weren't the only female passengers on board the Titanic, because not all the lists have survived. The passenger lists for all passengers who boarded at Southampton and then Queenstown, they've all survived, but those who boarded in Cherbourg, because of course those were the three stops, boarded at Southampton, stopped off at Queenstown, stopped off at Cherbourg. Sadly, the passenger lists for those who boarded in Cherbourg, the European leg, have not survived. But yeah, out the passengers that boarded at Southampton and Queenstown, 353 were female, and thereby they're making the sea angry. But no, in total, the total number of passengers was 1,317. I think that's excluding crew. 324 in first class, 284 in second, and 709 in third class. And in total, out of all the passengers, including the Cherbourg contingent, 805 were male and 434 were female. There was 112 children as well, and tragically, this is really sad, the largest of which were in third class. Of course, the highest number of casualties were from the third class passengers, really. But one thing that's quite thankful, and you might not actually realise this, is that the Titanic was actually considerably under capacity. This was her maiden voyage. While she had 1,317 passengers on board, she could actually accommodate 2,453. So, I mean, the number of lifeboats on board and what we know now, how awful would it have been if the ship actually was at capacity, if it had that extra, nearly almost another 1,000 passengers. Well, I think it is another 1,000 passengers on board. Doesn't bed dread thinking about. But looking at the passenger list themselves is very interesting, particularly for the first class. So if you're looking at the first class passenger list for the Titanic, it pretty much is a who's who of the prominent upper class of Edwardian Britain and America, I guess. Socialites, all sorts. I mean, that's because travelling in first class was not cheap. This is a single person berth in first class could cost between £30, which today would be just over £3,000, or 870,000, or 870 pounds for a parlour suite, which would give you a small private promenade deck and everything. But that £870 back in 1912 would be £87,000 today. So those first class passengers dishing out top dollar were basically paying around 90 grand in today's money, which is a lot for. I mean, I know you were travelling in the lap of luxury, but it gives you an idea of the calibre of passenger, how wealthy those in first class were, and they enjoyed all kinds of amazing perks. The first class passengers had a gymnasium, a squash court, saltwater swimming pools, electric and Turkish baths. They had their own barber shop, kennels for the dogs. More on kennels and barber shops in a second. Elevators. I mean, the list goes on, and of course, these first class passengers in many cases weren't just travelling alone, they were travelling with their staff, their valets, their maids, their nurses, governesses for their children, cooks, all sorts. I'm just going to have a quick look at the comments before I'll come back to the comments. I'm going to get through my Titanic stuff. So yeah, superstition one. Women make the sea angry. Well, there were many female passengers on board. I know that's a bit of an obvious one, but this is my way of taking you to the records, I guess. Superstition two. It's unlucky to have a priest on board. And passenger lists and crew actually revealed that There were a number of priests on board. Another resource, we have another collection of records called what they are called. Let me just find the maritime deaths. I think England and Wales maritime deaths or something. Go to our A to Z of record search and pop in maritime deaths and you'll get them back. But basically, these are lists of people who died at sea, and a lot of the victims of the Titanic are in these records. And they record the occupation of each person who drowned at sea, or however they died at sea. Anyway, obviously they didn't all drown, but we found 4 ministers of religion who died on board the Titanic. One of them, probably one of the best known, was a chap called Thomas Russell David Biles. With a name like that, he wasn't that hard to find in the records. So I did a little bit of digging and found out quite a bit about him, actually. So he was born in Leeds. He was the eldest of 7 children, born the son of a Congregationalist minister. He was a very clever chap. He studied theology at Balliol College. I don't think that's how you pronounce it, at Oxford. And even though he was the son of a Congregationalist minister, he converted to the Church of England and later followed his younger brother and became a Roman Catholic, converted to the Roman Catholic faith. And that's when he changed his name to Thomas, because he was actually born Russell David Biles, not Thomas Russell David Biles. So he went to Beda College in Rome, studied for the priesthood, and was ordained in 1902, where he became the parish priest of St Helens in Chipping Ongar in Essex. And if any of you have ever been to the parish church in Chipping Ongar, St Helens Parish Church, there's actually a very lovely stained glass window depicting Thomas, because he was very brave. In fact, there have even been efforts made to have him beatified, to have him made a saint. Anyway, why was he on the Titanic? Anyway, so yeah, his younger brother William moved to New York City, where he got engaged to be married, and he invited Thomas over to conduct the ceremony. So that is why Thomas was sailing to New York from Southampton. He was going to marry his brother. On the morning of the sinking, Father Biles said mass. The octave of Easter, because of course it was the 14th of April, for both second and third class passengers in their respective lounges. He was a man of the people, was Thomas. His sermon was, you can find all this in the newspapers as well. The sermon was on the need for a spiritual lifeboat in the shape of prayer, and the sacraments when in danger of spiritual shipwreck in times of temptation, which is tragically prophetic, given that the next day, in the next couple of days, everyone was going to be in need of a literal lifeboat, let alone a spiritual one. When the Titanic actually hit the iceberg, apparently Biles was walking on the upper deck praying. But he instantly sprung into action. He was, as you can see, the fact that he was giving his sermon to the third and second class passengers. Those were the people he cared for. As the ship was sinking, he assisted many, many, many third class passengers up the boat and made sure they got onto lifeboats. Apparently, definitely twice he refused a place on a lifeboat, but other sources claimed he refused it multiple times. And right up until the end, he was heard reciting prayers, giving confession and absolution to more than 100 passengers who had become trapped on the stern of the ship after all the lifeboats had launched. And apparently he was a rallying figure, a priest in a time of great peril. People were flocking to him. And just like the band that didn't stop playing until the last minute, he was right there amongst this crowd of desperate, panicked people, giving absolution, giving comfort, hearing confessions. And he went down with the ship. Very sadly, his body was never recovered, and it's because of these efforts that Pope Pius, the 10th, I think, Pope Pius X, described him as a martyr for the church, and as I said, efforts were actually made to have him made a saint. So yeah, an incredible man. So up to sailor superstition number 3. When you look at paintings of the golden age of sail, when you see paintings from the Battle of Trafalgar and things like that, you'll notice that a lot of the enlisted sailor, even the officers, they'll often have long hair. It was tied back in ponytails. Yeah, it was quite unusual to see a kind of 18th or early 19th sailor with short hair, and there was good reason for that. Cutting your hair at sea was seen as bad luck. And of course, as I mentioned before, the Titanic shop had its own barbershop. In fact, it had 2. one for first class passengers and one for second class passengers. And looking at the passenger lists and the crew lists, I've identified. I'm pretty sure I found 3 barbers who are on board the ship. There may have been more, but I've definitely found 3, and each of these men has a story. So the second class barbershop was located on E deck, and the first class was on C deck, where the third class passengers didn't get any haircuts. They either had to have one before or after the voyage. But even then, the first and second class barbershops were very small. They'd have a little waiting bench at the side, barber chairs on the other, and that would be about it. But the 3 barbers we found were a chap called Arthur White, who was he was quite a famous barber. He was formerly J.P. Morgan's personal barber. And I think J.P. Morgan actually owned the White Star Line. There was another chap called Charles Viekman, who was the head barber in the first class barbershop, and a Jewish chap called Herbert Klein from Leeds, who was the second class barber. While small, the first class barber did sound quite fancy. So it was open. You can find descriptions of it in the newspapers. Again, if you want to learn about what it was actually like on the Titanic, check out the newspapers. I can't urge you enough. I could have done this for days. Anyway, the first class barbershop. It was open between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Riekman, the head barber, was permanently on staff there, and he'd offer services like shampooing, shaving, hairdressing services for generally a shilling, which would be about £5, just over £5 today. So not that bad. Pretty reasonable, I think, for a first class barbershop. If I could get a haircut for £5 now, I'd be laughing. That'd be amazing. And even though it was small, it was still quite luxurious. He had a marble counter with 2 sinks, a leather-padded waiting bench, and he also sold small souvenirs, collectibles for purchase, things like postcards, White Star Line branded trinkets, tobacco, dolls, penknives, hats, all that kind of stuff. The second class one was a bit more basic. There was no I think it was basically just haircuts and shaving. That was all you got. Riekman, the head barber of the first class barbershop, Riekman, he did actually survive. Despite staying at his post, he was fortunate enough to actually be rescued from the water after the ship had sunk. White and Klein, unfortunately, were not quite as fortunate. I'm not sure whether they stayed at their posts, but both were listed in the lists of fatalities. So, yeah, sadly, both White and Klein went down with their ship. So the first 3 we've had no women on board. There were loads of women on board. No priests. We've at least 4 priests on board. Don't cut your hair at sea. There were two barber shops and 3 barbers. Loads of people getting haircuts. Superstition number 4. This one was a bit more tenuous, but animals on board the ship I thought was quite interesting. So that is, excuse me for this one. It is quite tenuous. Apparently, if sailors see a dog standing near fishing tackle, that's very bad luck. Bear with me. So I'm not sure about fishing tackle, but there were a lot of dogs on the Titanic. And again, you can see this in the records. It's all over the newspapers, and it's also listed in the ship's inventories as well. Modern historians now reckon there were loads of animals. There were dogs, cats, chickens, parrots. Obviously, there was an unknown number of rats. But an article I found in the Western Times, which was printed on the 20th of April 1912, said that so that was it. Modern historians reckon 3 dogs survived the sinking. But I found a newspaper article that said 5 dogs and a little pet pig survived. The little pet pig wasn't named, sadly, but it said that it was snuck onto a lifeboat by a wealthy female passenger who regarded her as a mascot. But some animals worked on the Titanic. The ship had its own official cat, Jenny. There were loads of articles about Jenny the cat in the newspaper archive. She's also, I don't know if she's in the crew list actually. I didn't look for her in there, but I should have done. She was kept on board, not kind of as a mascot, but also to keep the ship's population of rats and mice down. She was a seasoned ship's cat. Prior to serving on the Titanic, she'd been transferred over from the sister ship, the Olympic. And she normally lived in the galley, where the kitchen staff would feed her and her kittens scrap from the kitchens. Quite a well-known stewardess, Violet Jessup, who I will be telling you about in a second, actually wrote in her memoirs, "The cat laid her family near Jim, the scullion, whose approval she always sought and who always gave her warm devotion. I wasn't able to find out what happened to Jenny, but I think it's safe to assume she went down with the ship. Loads of dogs were brought on board as passengers. As I mentioned before, first class passengers actually had access to kennels, but most just kept the dogs in their cabin, probably with the knowledge of the crew, who might have turned a blind eye, even though they were not supposed to do so. And the ship's carpenter, John Hutchinson, was responsible for the ship's dogs' welfare. Was responsible for the dogs' welfare that were kept in the kennels. He would exercise them daily on the poop deck, along with the steward and one of the bellboys. But not every passenger approved of this. There was quite an famous American painter on board called Francis David Millett, who wrote in a letter sent from the Titanic's last stop, Queenstown in Ireland. He wrote, "Looking over the passenger list, I only find 3 or 4 people I know, but there are a number of obnoxious, ostentatious American women, the scourge of any place they infest." Apologies to any Americans watching. This is just this chap. This is an American painter writing this anyway. And worse on shipboard than anywhere. Many of them carry tiny dogs and lead husbands around like pet lambs. Um, the dog's owners had actually planned to hold a dog show on the ship on the morning of the 15th of April. But obviously, the ship would sink the preceding night, and that would never take place. But if you look at there are records of some of the dogs who survived. So, like, just to name drop a few, there was a King Charles Spaniel, an elderly Airedale Terrier owned by a chap called William Carter. There was a Chow Chow named Chow Chow, who was taken on board by a chap called Harry Anderson. There was even a champion French bulldog called Gamin de Picon, who was owned by Robert William Daniel, who bought him in England for a high price of about £150, which in today's money is over 14 grand. Obviously, the multimillionaire Jacob John Astor famously took his Airedale Terrier, Kitty, on board. I mean, the list goes on. My favourite probably was Frou Frou, a toy dog owned by a lady called Helen Bishop. The dog was allowed to stay in her cabin as the stewardess considered it too pretty to put among the bigger dogs in the kennels. There was also a hero dog, a Rigel, a black Newfoundland, who was reported to have actually saved many survivors. However, some people have actually questioned whether he could have survived the long swim in the Irish Ocean, and there's no contemporary evidence that actually happened. Another interesting detail was that there was a passenger called Charles Moore of Washington, D.C., who made a very, very last-minute decision to change his plans to transport 100 English foxhounds on board the Titanic. He was going to do this. He intended to start an English-style fox hunt in the Washington area, but at the last minute he changed his travel plans, and the 100 lucky English foxhounds were taken to Washington on another vessel. Gosh, at this rate, I'm not going to have time to talk about anything else. We're nearly there. We've got two more sailors, two more sailors superstitions to go through. Sailor superstition number 5. People with red hair apparently can bring bad luck to a ship. This was another one that was believed relatively widely, I think. And again, as I said before, merchant ABC records can give you quite a bit of information on people on workers. So, for example, there was a chap called John Alexander Podesta who was a fireman on the Titanic, and you can find his Merchant Navy index card describing his hair colour as being red. You'll find others that have descriptions, but of course, one of the most famous red-headed kind of harbingers of doom on board the Titanic was a nurse by the name of Violet Jessop. Violet Jessop had very thick auburn hair with a central parting in the Edwardian style. She was a very attractive woman, actually, and she led a fascinating life. And I actually thought Violet was an ancestor of mine, because I actually do have a Violet Jessop in my family tree, and I got very excited. No relation whatsoever. So Violet Constance Jessop, the reason she's quite famous was because she survived 3 ship sinkings. She survived the disastrous sinking of the Titanic in 1912. She survived the sinking of her sister ship, HMS Britannic, in 1916. And she also was on board the RMS Olympic when that was hit by a British warship, HMS Hawke, in 1911. So maybe there's something in the fact that people with red hair bring bad luck to ships. I don't know. I mean, Violet certainly didn't seem to have the best luck when it came to sailing, but she had an amazing story. So she was actually an Irish Argentine. So she was born in Argentina to Irish immigrants. She was 16. When she was 16, her father died, and she moved back to England with her family. And her mother took up work as a stewardess on ships. And when her mother became too ill to work, Violet followed in her mother's footsteps and herself became a stewardess. Um, her first position was with the Royal Mail liner Orinoco in 1908. But then in 1911 she began working on the Olympic. That was a sister ship of the Titanic. That was the largest civilian liner at that time. And on the 20th of September, it was struck by the British warship HMS Hawke. There were no fatalities, quite bad damage, but everyone got off alive. And I think, given the fact that the next two disasters she survived were so terrible, she didn't even bother mentioning the collision in her memoirs. Her memoirs are very interesting, actually. I've started reading them, and yeah, I think they're going to be brilliant. But yeah, when she was on the Titanic, she was only 24 years old. Um, she described in her memoirs how she was ordered up onto deck because she was basically meant to function as an example of how to behave for the non-English speakers who could not follow the instructions. You know, kind of like you get someone on an airplane guiding you. That was what she was going to do. She watched as the crew boarded the lifeboats. She was later ordered into lifeboat number 16. And this is, I love this story. As the boat was being lowered, one of the officers gave her a baby, just a random baby to take. And the next morning, with the rest of when she was picked up by the RMS Carpathia, she was sat on the deck with this little baby that she'd been nursing and looking after all night. And a woman, presumably the baby's mother, just ran up, grabbed the baby, and ran off without saying a word. And Violet never saw the baby again, but she may have heard from it. Because, of course, after surviving the sinking of the Titanic, so during World War One, Jessup served in the British Red Cross. You can find her in our Red Cross records. She was on the HMHS Britannic on the morning of November 21st, 1916. Basically, the Britannic had been converted into a hospital ship, and it was sunk in the Aegean Sea. At the time, no one knew why it sunk. There were conspiracy theories circulated that the British sunk it themselves to make the Germans look bad, but they did a big archaeological dive in 2016 and found out that it had actually hit a deep sea mine. But I mean, her memoirs from that sinking are really quite scary. So the Britannic sunk in 55 minutes. Only 30 out of the 1,066 passengers on board were killed. But she described in her memoirs how she basically had to jump out of her lifeboat because it was being sucked into the propellers, and that actually did kill some people. The propellers at the stern were sucking lifeboats in. She had to jump out at the last minute. You could make a great film about this. And she received a very traumatic head injury that she was lucky to survive. But she described it herself in her memoir. She said, "The white pride of the ocean's medical world dipped her head a little, then a little lower and still lower. All the deck machinery fell into the sea like child's toys. Then she took a fearful plunge, her stern rearing hundreds of feet into the air, until with a final roar she disappeared into the depths." So amazingly, she carried on working for the White Star Line into the 1920s. I mean, she was certainly brave. But one of the great stories from her later life, I love this. She claimed that one night, I think in the 1950s, after she'd retired to Suffolk, during a stormy evening, she received a phone call. And she picked up the phone, and a random voice who didn't introduce himself said, "Were you the person that saved the baby the night the Titanic sank?" And Jessup replied, "Yes." And the voice then said, "I was that baby," and hung up. Some people have said that it was probably just local people doing a prank call, but Violet was pretty adamant. She said, when she was talking to her biographer, she said, "I've never told that story to anyone before, and I'm convinced of its truthfulness." So yeah, an amazing life. She was winkingly called Miss Unsinkable because she became quite famous, and died of heart disease in 1971 at the ripe old age of 83. So my last Titanic superstition, I didn't actually intend for this to go on so long. which is number 6. Flowers are unlucky on board a ship. And just look up Titanic flowers in the newspapers, and you'll find vivid descriptions of what was on board. There were a lot. So first class cabins had fresh flowers placed in there every single day along the mantelpiece by the maids. Suites had fresh white roses laid on, pink carnations. The really expensive suites, the ones that were about 90k in today's money, the ones with the private promenade deck, they received fresh poppies and daffodils at breakfast every morning. Daffodils were in season because it was April. And regular first class cabins had carnations only. First class dining area was also kind of like a scene from Elton John's living room, I think. Elegant floral displays everywhere. They were used to decorate dessert trays, freesias with roses placed around decorative green foliage. Each table would have carnations and decorative plumes, daffodils, all sorts. Second class cabins were not given fresh flowers. However, the second class dining room did have an array of flowers along the windows and tables. So yeah, and due to space, there were so many flowers on the Titanic that the ship's fridges were mainly the flowers basically were kept in the ship's fridges, and there were a lot of fridges set aside to keep flowers in. And in another this is a bit of a silly one, but another chap we found in our Merchant Navy Seaman records, he was a fireman on board the Titanic. We found that he had a tattoo on his right arm depicting a basket of flowers. So not physical flowers, but still. But anyway, those were my 6 superstitions and what we found out about them in the records. There's loads. So yeah, you can find, in summary, there's loads of info you can dig out on the Titanic. Check out passenger lists, check out newspapers, check out the White Star Line officer's book. Lots of interesting things in there. So Jackie Fielding said Edward Hipkins, director of Avery Scales, died with the Titanic. See book Life and Balance by Andrew Lude. I'm going to check that out. And just see everybody talking to each other in the comments. Phoebe Curran said, hubby had an elusive sailor ancestor, this will be for question of the week, a commander on his side, but despite much help from Portsmouth Naval Library, they could not find any more than I already had. I suspect his father was well known, but would not admit it. Otherwise, how did he rise up in the Navy so quickly? Maybe newspapers are worth a go. Jim Crouch said, I haven't been able to find passenger lists from my Italian grandparents. Grandfather sailed from Naples to New York from July 10th, 1905 and landed in New York on July 16th, 1905. It's hard to read writing naturalization writing on naturalization documents. Yeah, it is, but naturalization documents are another amazing resource. Graham Kath Campbell said, my uncle Donald Joseph Campbell, World War II, served on hospital ships with the Navy at sea. Don't know who in here would know of him. Please contact if you do. Well, if someone does, do let Graham know. Glad to enjoy the broadcast as well. Great. Well, I think with 10 minutes to go, I was going to do some life lessons from the home front, but I think I might have to leave that to next week because I thought I'd like to take a quick look at tomorrow's historical anniversary. I love this, right? Put your imagining hat on. Imagine you had this like magical time machine that you could take you back in time, but only to one specific day, April 18th to be precise. So you go to time machine, but you could go to any April the 18th on any day in history. Where would you go? Well, there'd be quite a few cool April 18th that you could check out. You could go to Boston in 1775, and if you went back to Boston on April the 18th that year, you would see Paul Revere take his famous midnight ride. You could go to Zimbabwe in 1980, and you could see the birth of a nation. But if it was me, I would go back to April the 18th. 1930, and I would sit in a British living room and listen to the BBC news broadcast for that day, because on April the 18th, 1930, at 8:45 p.m, people all over Britain tuned into the news. They flipped on their radios, and instead of hearing the latest headlines, they just got a very soothing announcement that said, "Good evening. Today is Good Friday. There is no news." And for the rest of that 15-minute slot, they just played some lovely piano music. And I just love that because it's just so mad to think about that today. I mean, nowadays we're bombarded with news from everywhere. Like we hear it from our friends, our colleagues. It's fired directly at us in our social media feeds, whether that be Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is. It's beamed straight into our homes. I mean, constant news consumption is pretty much a part of modern life now. I mean, I think it's got so extreme that if people, those who actively avoid it are so interesting, they make headlines themselves. We put those people in the papers. So I think in that kind of context, that this is a day with no news is just a wonderful little historical reminder uh, about the history of news, I mean, what the BBC was originally supposed to be, and kind of how that differs from what it's evolved into today. Because I mean, one of the things you've got to bear in mind is that in 1930 the BBC was very, very new. It was only about a decade old. Radio broadcasting was still completely in its infancy, and was therefore quite a bit more amateurish than it would be today, I guess. But yeah, so BBC had only been around for about 10 years. Its approach was to directly counter what the United States had been doing with radio, which was basically opening licensing up to anybody, allowing competition between a wide variety of commercial approaches, advertising, all that kind of stuff. Um, instead, the BBC was the only game in town. They were chartered by the Crown. They had a monopoly over the airwaves, and with that with that came a lot of responsibility. They were given a very special mandate. um, Kind of rather than opening things up and appealing to absolutely everybody, the BBC aimed on raising the moral character of Britain. Um, a kind of mission that it took very seriously and would be seen as incredibly elitist today. Really, I mean, it was think think about it actually now. Everything they did back then, like watching the King's Speech is a prime example. Everything, that kind of atmosphere of raising standards. What I'm trying to get is your newsreader reading the news in 1930, even though no one could have seen him, you can guarantee he would have been wearing a dinner jacket. Things have to be done a certain way. But basically, in other words, the BBC kind of decided what was worth reporting on. And I think, according to them, it was better to just completely stay silent than lower the bar, than lower standards, than dumb things down. Um, but part of it also depended on where radio announcers got their news from. So back then, the BBC didn't create their own news. They got their stories from Reuters and Press Association. Another one was called Central News Agency, the Exchange Telegraph Company. So these news wires that, like Reuters and Press Association, are still very much going today. They'd have these tape machines that would kind of just push news out to the newsroom all day, and the BBC readers would pick and choose from that. The yearly review from 1930 actually put it quite specifically. They said, a very definite standard of quality is aimed at, and when there was not sufficient news judged worthy of being broadcast, no attempt was made to fill the gap. Which is just, I think, crazy, particularly when you think about the news agenda at the moment and how busy it is. But yeah, you just got to remember that BBC was and is publicly funded. Audience pays a license fee. Um, so the early BBC was basically forced, the very early BBC was kind of forced to choose between developing its own enormously expensive news gathering organisation from scratch, which at the time it just didn't have the money or resources to do, um, or newswire services. And another thing to remember as well is that the press of the day didn't like radio. They viewed it as competition, and you can guarantee that if the BBC had developed their own kind of news sourcing agency, the newspapers would have decried it as a waste of public money. So they relied on um, they relied on these wires because news gathering was not seen as central to the BBC's mission. Even though I guess the Director General of the BBC, John Reith, famously said its mission was to inform, educate, and entertain. So yeah, they basically BBC made no claim to creating or even curating their own news. But still, like there must have been some news that happened on April 18th, 1930, right? There must have been. Well, yeah, there was. Um, there are other historical sources that tell us what was actually going on. You can look at the newspapers. Look at the newspapers for April 30th and the days following. You'll see that actually some pretty big things happened. I mean, one thing that was going on at the moment was the British government was trying to respond to some allegations that had been printed in the newspapers the day before. I can't remember exactly what the allegations were, but they were very keen to address these allegations. And Good Friday in the 1930s was still kind of a sacred public holiday. Newspapers wouldn't print. So their only way of doing that would have been addressing these allegations made in the newspapers on the radio. So it could have been that the BBC's kind of Day of No News was a way of asserting press independence. Maybe it was kind of a way of saying we are not the mouthpiece for the government. So no news for anyone today. That could have been one of it. I think probably the more believable reason is that April the 18th, 1930 was a Good Friday, and the newspapers weren't printing. Many people weren't working, so the news wires that the BBC were relying on to get their news wouldn't have been feeding them the news. So it could have been that it was basically a lack of actual updates, or an absence of staff within the BBC. One of those two. But one of the other things I saw in the newspapers that was quite interesting was one of the things that did happen on April the 30th was in India, a chap called Surya Sen, who was a big Bengali independence fighter, had led a successful raid on the British police outpost in Chittagong. But the reason that news didn't make, again, that was technology foiling the story. Even if the BBC had decided to report on this, they wouldn't have got the news because Surya Sen cut all the rail and telegraph lines during his attack. But yeah, I love that. It just harks back to a completely different time. And today, when we're being bombarded with quite negative news on a daily basis, I think wouldn't it be lovely to switch on the telly and for the news reporter to go, no news today. But yeah, I think really what was happening is the BBC were basically saying nothing happened on April the 18th, 1930 that a well-to-do, properly cultured British person needs to know about. And if there's nothing worth learning about, some pleasant music will be just as good for your moral character. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful little moment from history and one that I wanted to share with you. Sorry I didn't get time to chat through life lessons from the home front. We will save that for next week. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I'll have a look at some of, let's have a quick look at some comments. Claire Joey Brown saying they're the White Star Line officers' books. Yeah, if anyone's struggling to find anything on the site, just go to our A to Z of record search, pop in White Star or any keyword, and it will bring back the resources we have available for you. Ruth McConnell said, my 2 times great grandfather was John Edwards Turner, Edwards and Co., a wine shipping company out of Bristol. They were in business from 1834 into the 1970s. I found many amazing records of the ships they owned at the Bristol Records office, a great resource for the mariners of Bristol. Thank you very much for sharing that, Ruth. And Anya said, I'd love to find out more about who was at Culloden on the 16th of April, 1745. I have ancestors from Nairnshire, were very near Culloden, and family story passed down to DNA cousins. Was a family name changed to Smith. Have you? If he was captured, we've got Jacobite. No, Culloden. What am I talking about? I'm not. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm gonna leave it at that. Well, if anyone does have any tips for researching Culloden ancestors, please do pop them in the comments. But yeah, I think bang on 5 o'clock. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for everyone for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed listening to Waffle On. I'm going to make sure next week's is a little more interactive. There's more back and forth between me and you guys. But yeah, as always, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe. Let's stay connected, stay in touch with each other, and have wonderful weekends. And I will see you very soon. Bye now.